You're trespassing on HOA land. I'm calling the sheriff." That's what Brenda Kessler said while standing in the middle of my driveway. I had just driven 6 hours to my dead uncle's valley cabin to sort through his belongings. Instead, I was greeted by 3 HOA women, a clipboard, and a threat of arrest. "This entire valley was condemned by community standards," Brenda snapped, already dialing. 10 minutes later, the sheriff arrived. Brenda was smiling like she'd already won, until the deputy looked at the cabin, looked at me, and quietly said, "Ma'am, this man owns the valley." That's when Brenda dropped her clipboard. Stay with me, because what happened after the sheriff ran the records sent the entire HOA into panic mode. What would you do if someone tried to kick you off land your family owned for generations? Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this insane situation. My name's Marcus, and 3 weeks earlier, I'd gotten the call that my great-uncle Ted had passed away. Uncle Ted was this legendary figure in our family, a Vietnam vet who'd lived off the grid in the Colorado mountains for 40 years. While the rest of us were grinding through city life, Uncle Ted was living like it was still 1980, chopping his own wood and growing his own food. The thing is, I was the only family member he'd ever trusted. Every summer as a kid, I'd spend weeks at his cabin in Pine Ridge Valley, learning to fish and hearing his war stories. When the lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited everything, I honestly wasn't surprised. What shocked me was that everything included 47 acres of prime mountain real estate. I planned a simple weekend trip from Denver, sort through his stuff, decide whether to keep or sell the cabin, maybe scatter his ashes by the creek where we used to fish, closure stuff. But driving up to the valley, I immediately noticed things had changed. Where there used to be dirt paths, now there were perfectly paved roads. Where I remembered wilderness, expensive houses sat like they'd always been there. And everywhere, I mean everywhere, there were these pristine white signs reading, "Pine Ridge Valley HOA, maintaining excellence since 2019. The smell of fresh asphalt mixed with Uncle Ted's familiar wood smoke scent hit me as I pulled into what used to be his peaceful driveway. That's when I saw her. Brenda Kessler looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for Suburban Karen, age 52. Perfect blonde bob, designer hiking boots that had never seen an actual trail, and that particular smile that screams, "I'm about to ruin your day." Behind her stood 2 other women who looked like they shared the same hairstylist and the same hobby of making other people miserable. "Excuse me," she said, stepping directly in front of my truck. "This property has been condemned by community standards. You can't park here." I rolled down my window, trying to stay polite. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. This is my uncle's cabin. I just inherited it." "Your uncle?" Brenda's laugh could have curdled milk. "Oh, honey, you mean that difficult old hermit who refused to participate in community improvement? Well, his property violations have been accumulating for years. Since he's no longer with us, the HOA is taking appropriate action." She handed me a thick packet through my truck window. The paper felt cheap and official at the same time, covered with violations I'd never heard of and fines that made my eyes water. "You have 48 hours to bring this property into compliance or we'll take legal action," she announced, like she was doing me a favor. Of course, the easiest solution would be to sell. I happen to know someone who might be interested in taking this problem off your hands. And that someone, she mentioned casually, was her husband Dale, who ran the local construction company, the sound of her heels clicking on Uncle Ted's wooden porch, wood he'd cut and fitted himself, made my teeth clench. This woman was standing on my family's property, threatening me with papers that probably weren't worth the ink they were printed with. But what really got me was how she talked about Uncle Ted. Difficult hermit. The man who'd taught me how to be honest, how to work with my hands, how to find peace in simple things. A decorated veteran who'd chosen a quiet life over the chaos that had already damaged him enough. "I'll need some time to review these documents," I told her, keeping my voice steady. "Of course, sweetie." That fake sweet tone again. "Just remember, 48 hours. We take community standards very seriously around here." As she walked away, her backup crew following like well-trained ducklings, I sat in my truck looking at Uncle Ted's cabin. It looked exactly like I remembered. Weathered, but solid, honest construction built to last. The kind of place where a man could think clearly and sleep peacefully. But now it was surrounded by McMansions, and apparently I was the problem. I spent that first evening actually reading through Brenda's violation packet. 17 different infractions ranging from non-conforming exterior paint to unsightly solar installation. The solar panels Uncle Ted had installed were apparently an eyesore, even though they'd been powering his cabin cleanly for 15 years. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Brenda marching up to my door with the same 3 women, plus a man I didn't recognize. All of them had their phones out, taking pictures like they were documenting a crime scene. "Morning," I said, opening the door before they could knock. "We're here for the official compliance inspection," Brenda announced. "This is Dale, my husband. He's generously offered to provide you with a quote for bringing your property up to community standards." Dale was exactly what you'd expect. Work boots, construction company shirt, and the kind of handshake that tries too hard to prove something. He walked around Uncle Ted's cabin like he was measuring it for a coffin. "Gonna need a full exterior renovation," he said, making notes on a clipboard. "New roof, new siding, probably have to tear down that solar array. Looking at maybe 80, 90,000 to get it compliant." "And if I choose not to make these improvements?" I asked. Brenda's smile got wider. "Then we'll have to call the authorities about the health and safety violations. Can't have a condemned property endangering the community." That's when she pulled out her phone. "Sheriff's Department? Yes, this is Brenda Kessler, president of Pine Ridge Valley HOA. We have a trespasser on condemned HOA property who's refusing to leave." I have to give her credit for confidence. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd clearly gotten her way before, referencing community safety concerns and liability issues like she was reading from a legal textbook. 20 minutes later, Deputy Rodriguez pulled up in his cruiser. He looked like he'd handled property disputes before, professional, but clearly expecting a routine eviction. "Afternoon, folks. Got a call about a trespassing situation?" "Yes, officer." Brenda stepped forward immediately. "This man is squatting on condemned HOA property. We've asked him to leave, but he's being belligerent and threatening." The deputy looked at me. "Sir, do you have any documentation showing you have a right to be here?" I handed him Uncle Ted's will and the property deed. "I inherited this cabin from my uncle 3 weeks ago. These documents should show I'm the legal owner." Deputy Rodriguez studied the papers, and I watched his expression change. He walked back to his cruiser and spent several minutes on his radio, running the property information through the county system. When he came back, the look on his face told me everything. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "this man owns the valley." The clipboard crashed to the gravel like a gunshot. "What?" Brenda's voice cracked. "That's impossible. The HOA has jurisdiction over this entire development. We've been managing community standards for 5 years. According to county records," Deputy Rodriguez said carefully, "this property has been in the same family since 1962. The HOA was established in 2019. You can't retroactively claim authority over properties that existed before your formation." Here's something most people don't know about HOA law, and I sure didn't know it then. Homeowner associations can only govern properties that voluntarily joined when they were created or purchased afterwards. If your property existed before the HOA was formed, they have about as much authority over you as your neighbor's cat. Brenda's 3 backup Karens suddenly found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. They mumbled excuses and scattered like roaches when the lights come on, leaving Brenda standing alone with her husband, staring at legal documents that had just blown up her entire power structure. "There must be some mistake," she kept saying. "We've been operating under proper authority. I have connections at the county. This needs to be investigated immediately." Deputy Rodriguez gave me his card and quietly suggested I document any future harassment. He also mentioned this wasn't the first complaint about aggressive HOA enforcement in the area. As the deputy drove away, Brenda's mask finally slipped. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with or what you've just started." The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth as I watched her storm off, but something told me this was just the beginning. That evening, I drove to the county clerk's office before they closed. If I was going to fight this, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The records told a fascinating story. Uncle Ted's father had homesteaded the entire Pine Ridge Valley in 1962, back when it was just wilderness and possibility. The family had owned 347 acres of pristine mountain land for decades before anyone else even knew the place existed. According to the filing dates, the Pine Ridge Valley HOA was incorporated on March 15, 2019, 57 years after my family's original ownership. Brenda had been signing documents claiming authority over land that had never belonged to the association. But here's where it got interesting. I found records showing that several families had been forced to sell and leave the valley over the past 3 years. Each sale happened after a campaign of violations, fines, and harassment remarkably similar to what Brenda had just tried on me. The next morning, I woke up to orange "condemned" stickers plastered all over Uncle Ted's cabin. Someone had also filed anonymous complaints with the building inspector and health department, all claiming the property was uninhabitable and dangerous to the community. Around noon, a county building inspector showed up at my door. "Mr. Williams, I'm here about reports of unsafe living conditions and code violations." The inspector, a weathered guy named Jim who clearly knew his job, walked through Uncle Ted's cabin expecting to find the disaster he'd been told about. Instead, he found a property that was not only up to code, but maintained better than most houses half its age. "Whoever called this in," Jim said, making notes on his clipboard, "either hasn't been here or has a very different definition of uninhabitable than the state of Colorado does." As he was leaving, Jim pulled me aside. "Between you and me," he said quietly, "this is the 4th anonymous complaint I've gotten about this exact property in the past 6 months, all from the same phone number, all claiming violations that don't exist." That's when I learned about something called selective enforcement. HOAs are supposed to apply rules equally to all properties, but some corrupt associations target specific homeowners with harassment campaigns while ignoring identical issues elsewhere. It's not just unfair, it's illegal. I spent the rest of that day researching Brenda Kessler and the Pine Ridge Valley HOA finances. What I found made my stomach turn. The association was carrying massive debt from a $300,000 beautification project that had never been completed. The contractor for that failed project? Dale Kessler Construction. The money had disappeared, but the promised improvements had never materialized, which meant the HOA was desperate for new revenue sources. Uncle Ted's 47 acres represented a huge potential income stream if they could force me to join the association and pay their inflated fees and special assessments. Around sunset, I heard boots on my porch. Dale Kessler stood there with 2 other men, all of them looking like they'd just finished a construction job. "Mind if we come in for a chat?" Dale asked, though they were already walking through my door. They looked around Uncle Ted's cabin like they were appraising it for demolition. Dale picked up Uncle Ted's purple heart from the mantel, turning it over in his hands. "Your uncle was quite the character," he said. "Shame he never learned to get along with his neighbors." The threat was clear without being spoken. Dale examined Uncle Ted's electrical panel with the kind of attention that made my skin crawl. He checked the propane connections to the water heater. He looked at things a normal visitor wouldn't notice. "You know," Dale said as they were leaving, "accidents happen all the time in these old mountain cabins. Electrical fires, gas leaks, real dangerous for someone who doesn't understand the systems." After they left, I ordered security cameras online for overnight shipping. If this was going to escalate, I wanted everything documented. But I also called my neighbor, Doris Heather, an elderly woman Uncle Ted had mentioned in his letters. At 78 years old, she'd lived in the valley for 30 years and had watched Brenda's rise to power. "Oh, honey," Doris said when I told her what was happening. "You're the 4th family she's done this to. The Hendersons, the young couple with the kids, and the Breslin family, all forced out after Brenda decided they didn't fit her vision for the community." The sound of Doris's voice shaking with anger told me everything I needed to know about what my neighbors had endured. "But you're different," she added. "You've got something they didn't have, legal ownership that predates her authority. If anyone can stop her, it's you." As I hung up the phone, I realized this wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. This was about justice for everyone Brenda had bullied out of their homes. I woke up to complete darkness and the smell of burned electrical wiring. Someone had ripped apart my main electrical panel during the night, cutting wires and destroying the breaker system Uncle Ted had installed. Worse, they'd loosened the propane connection to my water heater just enough to create a dangerous gas leak. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was sabotage that could have killed me. At 7 a.m. sharp, Brenda appeared at my door with a coffee cup and the world's most fake, concerned expression. "Oh my goodness, Marcus, I heard you had some trouble last night. Dale mentioned he smelled gas when he drove by this morning. How terrible." She offered Dale's services for emergency repairs at a friendly neighbor discount. The woman whose husband had likely caused the damage was now offering to profit from fixing it. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I think I'll handle the repairs myself." "Are you sure that's wise? These old mountain cabins can be so dangerous. Maybe you'd be safer selling and finding a place more suitable for someone unfamiliar with valley living." While I was calling the electric company and a licensed plumber, my security cameras arrived. I spent the morning installing hidden cameras around the cabin's perimeter, making sure to position them where they'd capture anyone approaching the electrical or gas systems. That afternoon, while digging a trench to run camera cables, I found something that changed everything. Buried under Uncle Ted's cabin foundation, wrapped in waterproof material, was a metal box containing documents that told the real story of Pine Ridge Valley. The original homestead grant from 1962 showed that Uncle Ted's father hadn't just owned 47 acres. He'd owned 347 acres, including the entire valley floor where the current HOA development now sat. But here's the kicker. The family had never actually sold the land. According to a 1995 lease agreement, they'd rented development rights to a construction company for 99 years, with monthly payments of $3,000 due to Uncle Ted's estate. Those payments had stopped 5 years ago, right around the time Brenda Kessler became HOA treasurer. I cross-referenced the dates and found that the HOA now owed Uncle Ted's estate, which meant me, over $180,000 in back rent. And according to the lease terms, missed payments triggered a default clause that would return full property control to the original landowners. Which meant I didn't just own my uncle's cabin. I owned the land that 200 families had built their homes on. The lease agreement had one more surprise, a clause requiring the development company to inform new residents about the underlying land ownership. That notification had never happened, which meant the entire HOA had been operating under false authority for years. I drove back to the county clerk's office and found copies of the original lease in their files. Someone had signed the viewing log to examine these documents 2 years ago. Brenda Kessler. She'd known the truth all along. Her entire harassment campaign wasn't about HOA authority or community standards. It was about covering up massive financial fraud and illegal appropriation of my family's land. That evening, Brenda organized an emergency HOA meeting about the dangerous element that had moved into the community. According to the email blast she sent to all residents, I was a violent drifter with a criminal background who posed a threat to community safety. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so vicious. The woman who'd been systematically robbing my family for 5 years was calling me the criminal. But I had a plan. Brenda's emergency meeting was scheduled for the following week, where she intended to hold an emergency vote to condemn my property. Perfect. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy builds for herself. Uncle Ted had left me one final message in that waterproof box. A letter explaining that he'd known about the financial irregularities but felt too old and tired to fight. He'd trusted that I would set things right when the time comes, and included detailed evidence of Brenda's embezzlement and document fraud. "The valley deserves honest people," he'd written. "Make sure they get the chance to be." I spent that night reading through 3 generations of family documents, understanding for the first time why Uncle Ted had chosen such a quiet life. After seeing the worst of humanity in Vietnam, he'd found peace in mountains and honest work. But peace isn't the same thing as surrender. And tomorrow, I was going to prove that Uncle Ted had raised his nephew right. The taste of mountain air mixed with anticipation told me that justice was finally within reach. Uncle Ted's hidden documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that went back years. The complete homestead records showed that the Kessler family had owned Pine Ridge Valley since 1962, when the government granted Uncle Ted's father 347 acres of wilderness under the Homestead Act. What I'd thought was a simple cabin inheritance was actually a massive land holding that included every house, road, and mailbox in the current development. The 1995 lease agreement was a masterpiece of legal precision. Uncle Ted's family had retained ownership while allowing development, with strict terms requiring monthly payments and complete transparency about the underlying land ownership. The construction company was supposed to inform every home buyer that they were purchasing a house on leased land. That never happened. Instead, families bought homes thinking they owned the land underneath, while a development company collected both their purchase money and lease payments from Uncle Ted. When the company eventually went bankrupt, the HOA was created to manage the community. but nobody told them they were managing other people's land. Except Brenda had discovered the truth 2 years ago and decided to bury it instead of reveal it. The financial records showed a pattern of embezzlement that would make a mob accountant proud. Over 5 years, she'd diverted $180,000 in lease payments that should have gone to Uncle Ted's estate. She'd also skimmed an additional $150,000 from community special assessments, inflating project costs and pocketing the difference through her husband's construction company. But the most damning evidence was what Uncle Ted called the pattern. 3 families had been forced out of the valley over the past few years, and each family had been getting close to discovering the truth about land ownership. The elderly Hendersons had questioned why their property taxes didn't match their supposed ownership. The young Peterson family had researched mineral rights for a water well. The Breslin family had hired a surveyor who'd found discrepancies in the property boundaries. Each family had been targeted for harassment immediately after making these inquiries. Brenda's campaigns weren't random vindictiveness. They were strategic elimination of potential whistleblowers. I called the property rights attorney my research had found in Denver, and she confirmed what Uncle Ted's documents suggested. The lease default gave me the legal right to reclaim the entire valley, which would essentially evict 200 families from homes they thought they owned. But, she cautioned, you'd be destroying people's lives to recover property that was stolen through fraud. Most of these families are innocent victims who were lied to about what they were buying. That's when I understood Uncle Ted's final test. He'd left me with the power to seek justice or revenge, and the wisdom to know the difference. The moral choice was clear. I didn't want to destroy a community. I wanted to save it from the people who'd been destroying it systematically. Uncle Ted's letter had included one more piece of evidence: recordings he'd made of conversations with Brenda over the years. She'd approached him multiple times, offering to buy his property for far below market value. When he'd refused, she'd threatened him with HOA violations and legal action. In the final recording, made just months before his death, Brenda had said something that made my blood boil. "Face it, old man. Nobody cares about you or your family's history. This valley belongs to people who can improve it properly." Uncle Ted's response had been quiet but firm. "Miss, you're standing on my family's land. And someday, someone who cares about family will be standing where you are." Tomorrow's emergency HOA meeting would be that someday. The documents also revealed that Brenda had convinced county officials to ignore the original land ownership through a combination of bribes and misinformation. 3 different county employees had received consulting fees from Dale's construction company in exchange for misfiling documents and ignoring complaints about the HOA's authority. This wasn't just neighborhood drama. This was a criminal conspiracy that had operated for years under cover of community improvement and property values. I spent the night organizing evidence and planning how to present the truth in a way that would protect innocent families while exposing the criminals who'd victimized them. Uncle Ted's photograph on the mantel seemed to watch me work, and I could almost hear him saying, "Do it right, son. These good people deserve better than what they've been getting." I started by contacting the 3 families Brenda had forced out of the valley. Doris Heather had kept in touch with all of them, and each family was eager to help expose the truth once they learned what had really happened. The Hendersons, forced out over alleged garden violations, still had documentation showing that identical gardens throughout the development were ignored while theirs was targeted. The Peterson family had recordings of Brenda threatening their children's safety if they didn't sell immediately. The Breslins had evidence of Dale's construction company submitting fraudulent estimates for mandatory property improvements. Each family agreed to return for the emergency HOA meeting as witnesses. I organized all the evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore or discredit. Original deeds and land grants, professionally copied and notarized. Bank records showing the missing lease payments. Security footage of Dale's sabotage attempts. County records proving Brenda had known about the land ownership for 2 years. My attorney helped me prepare multiple resolution options. I could demand immediate eviction of the entire development under the lease default terms. I could renegotiate the lease with honest HOA leadership and demand back payments. Or I could offer to sell the land directly to residents at fair prices, bypassing the corrupt HOA entirely. But the most important preparation was setting up the perfect public confrontation. Brenda had scheduled her emergency meeting for Thursday night at the community center, with plans to vote on condemning my property and authorizing necessary legal action to force my removal. She'd sent emails to all residents describing me as a dangerous outsider, threatening their property values and community safety. Perfect. A packed room full of concerned neighbors was exactly what I needed. I contacted the local newspaper reporter who'd covered previous HOA disputes, explaining that a major property rights story was about to break at Thursday's meeting. I reached out to the county commissioner mentioning potential municipal corruption that might interest his office. I even made sure the community Facebook page admin would be live streaming the meeting for residents who couldn't attend. Here's something most people don't realize about HOA authority. Associations are required to follow open meeting laws when making decisions that affect multiple properties. All residents have the right to attend meetings, request documentation, and challenge votes based on incomplete information. Brenda's attempt to rush through a condemnation vote could be challenged if residents weren't given access to complete financial and legal information. I spent Tuesday evening installing professional audio recording equipment in the community center, with permission from the building manager who'd grown tired of Brenda's increasingly erratic demands about facility usage. The psychological warfare was just as important as the legal preparation. I let Brenda see me looking defeated and overwhelmed whenever we crossed paths in town. I asked casual questions at the hardware store about moving companies and storage units. I wanted her to believe her intimidation campaign had worked. Meanwhile, I was building a coalition of Valley residents who'd grown tired of Brenda's tyranny. Tom Breslin, who ran the local hardware store, had been forced to pay business improvement fees for non-existent community projects. The young Peterson family had been threatened with fines over their children's playground equipment. Even some of Brenda's former supporters were beginning to question the increasing fees and authoritarian enforcement. Doris Heather became my unofficial intelligence coordinator, connecting me with residents who had stories to tell but had been afraid to speak up. The network of families who'd been intimidated, overcharged, and bullied was larger than I'd imagined. On Wednesday night, I visited Uncle Ted's grave for the first time since the funeral. The simple military headstone overlooked the valley he'd loved and protected for decades. The smell of pine trees and the sound of wind through mountains reminded me why this place was worth fighting for. "Tomorrow, Uncle Ted," I said quietly. "Tomorrow we set things right." The weight of responsibility felt lighter when I remembered that I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting for the kind of honest community Uncle Ted had always believed was possible. The night before the HOA meeting, I was reviewing my presentation when the security cameras triggered an alert on my phone. Dale Kessler was walking around my cabin with a gas can and a handful of matches. The footage was crystal clear. Dale pouring gasoline around the foundation, checking to make sure no one was watching, then striking a match near the wooden supports that held up Uncle Ted's 60-year-old cabin. I called 911 immediately, but I could already smell the gasoline fumes and see flickering light through my bedroom window. By the time the fire department arrived, flames were climbing the walls of the cabin where I'd spent childhood summers learning about honor and integrity from a war hero. The structure Uncle Ted's own hands had built was being destroyed by a man who'd spent years profiting from lies. Dale was standing in my yard when the firefighters pulled up, holding his gas can and claiming he'd been investigating reports of a gas leak when the fire mysteriously started. The fire chief took one look at the security footage on my phone and called for sheriff's department backup. That's when Brenda arrived, putting on the performance of her life. "Oh, Marcus," she wailed, running toward the burning cabin. "How terrible. Thank goodness Dale was here to help. He probably saved your life." The irony was breathtaking. The woman whose husband had just tried to burn me alive was positioning herself as my rescuer. "This proves what I've been saying," she announced to the gathered firefighters and neighbors. "This property is cursed. It's dangerous. Maybe this is a sign that you should take my offer and move somewhere safer." She actually pulled out a checkbook right there, with my family's cabin burning behind her, and offered to buy the damaged property for immediate cash. Deputy Rodriguez arrived as the fire was being extinguished, and I handed him my phone showing the security footage. The video showed Dale clearly and deliberately starting the fire, with audio of him talking to someone on the phone about making sure the problem goes away permanently. The deputy placed Dale under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and destruction of evidence. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Brenda completely lost her composure. "You don't understand," she screamed at the deputy. "This man is destroying our community. He's a dangerous outsider who doesn't belong here. We were protecting our families." The mask she'd worn for years fell away completely. Her voice cracked as she blamed everyone except herself. The community for being ungrateful, Uncle Ted for being selfish, and me for forcing them to take extreme measures. "Dale was just trying to protect what we've built," she shrieked. "This valley belongs to people who understand progress and community values." Several neighbors who'd come to watch the fire started backing away from Brenda as her hysteria escalated. People who'd supported her authority for years were seeing her true nature for the first time. Here's something crucial about arson laws. Attempting to destroy evidence is a separate felony with severe penalties, especially when human life is endangered. The security footage showing premeditation and coordination would make conviction almost certain, but the attempted murder had actually strengthened my legal position. The desperate criminality proved that Brenda knew her authority was fraudulent and her financial crimes were about to be exposed. Deputy Rodriguez quietly told me that Dale was already talking, trying to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for cooperation. He'd admitted to 3 years of property sabotage, witness intimidation, and financial fraud, all directed by his wife. As the emergency vehicles drove away and neighbors returned to their homes, I stood looking at Uncle Ted's damaged but salvageable cabin. The structure had survived Vietnam flashbacks, mountain winters, and 40 years of peaceful solitude. It would survive this too. Brenda made one final attempt at control as she was leaving. "Tomorrow's meeting is still happening," she announced, her voice hoarse from screaming. "The community deserves to hear the truth about what you've brought to our valley." I smiled and nodded. "I couldn't agree more, Brenda. The community absolutely deserves to hear the truth." The smell of smoke and gasoline hung in the mountain air as I spent the rest of the night making sure my evidence was safely stored in multiple locations. Tomorrow would bring justice not just for Uncle Ted, but for every family Brenda had victimized. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting criminals destroy themselves. Brenda spent the hours after Dale's arrest making desperate phone calls to every HOA supporter she could think of. I know this because Doris Heather's house shared a property line with Brenda's, and sound carries in the mountains. According to Doris, Brenda was calling residents until well past midnight, alternating between threats and bribes to ensure loyalty at tomorrow's meeting. "If you don't support me tomorrow, your property assessments are going to triple," she'd tell one neighbor. Then she'd call another and promise financial rewards for standing against the dangerous outsider threatening their community. At 1 a.m., Brenda showed up at my fire-damaged cabin with a suitcase. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 cash for an immediate deed transfer and your departure from the valley," she said, opening the suitcase to reveal more money than I'd ever seen in one place. "$500,000? I asked, genuinely surprised. "The community is prepared to buy you out to preserve what we've built here. You don't understand what this valley means to people who've invested their lives in creating something special." Then she tried a different approach, attacking Uncle Ted's memory. "Your uncle was a broken man who couldn't handle civilization," she said. "The war damaged him and he chose isolation over participating in society. You're following the same dangerous path toward mental breakdown and paranoia." The attack on Uncle Ted's character was where she made her fatal mistake. "Brenda," I said quietly, "Uncle Ted was a Purple Heart recipient who chose a simple life because he'd already given enough to his country. He taught me that honor matters more than money and that standing up for what's right is worth any personal cost." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "But please, keep talking. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on veterans and family values." That's when she completely lost control. "This entire valley was nothing before we developed it," she screamed. "Empty wilderness with one crazy hermit. We created jobs, we built homes, we made this place worth something, and you think you can destroy all of that because of some old papers?" She admitted to orchestrating the harassment campaigns, coordinating Dale's sabotage attempts, and systematically covering up the land ownership issues. "Those 3 families deserved what they got," she ranted. "They were asking too many questions, causing problems, threatening property values with their complaints and lawsuits." The recording captured everything: conspiracy, witness intimidation, fraud, and a complete confession to criminal activity spanning 3 years. Here's what most people don't know about recording laws in Colorado. As long as one party consents to the recording, it's completely legal and admissible in court. Brenda had just provided evidence that would put her away for years. When she finally ran out of steam, I asked her a simple question. "Are you finished?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you said everything you wanted to say? Because that recording is going straight to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning, right after I play it for the HOA meeting." The color drained from her face as she realized what she'd done. You can't use that. It was a private conversation. Actually, I can. And I will. Unless what? Unless you'd prefer to stand up tomorrow night and tell the community the truth yourself. Explain how you've been stealing from them for 3 years, lying about property ownership, and forcing out families who got too close to discovering your crimes. She grabbed her suitcase and stumbled toward her car, but turned back one final time. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she hissed. I have connections. County officials, judges, state representatives. Even if you win tomorrow, I'll bury you in legal bills and make your life hell. Brenda, I said, after tomorrow night, the only thing you'll be burying is your reputation. As her car disappeared down the mountain road, I sat on Uncle Ted's damaged porch and felt a peace I hadn't experienced since childhood. Tomorrow would bring justice, healing, and the chance for 200 families to live in a community built on honesty instead of fear. The sound of the creek flowing through the valley reminded me that some things endure despite the people who try to control them. The Pine Ridge Valley Community Center had never seen anything like Thursday night's crowd. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot. Local TV news crews had set up cameras after getting tips about a major municipal corruption story breaking tonight. Sheriff's deputies were stationed throughout the room for crowd control. I arrived early with my briefcase of evidence and took a seat in the back row, watching residents file in with the nervous energy of people who knew something big was about to happen. Brenda took the podium at exactly 7 p.m., looking like she hadn't slept in days. Dale's arrest had shaken her, but she was making one final attempt to control the narrative. Thank you all for coming to this emergency session, she began, her voice artificially bright. We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's safety and property values. She clicked to her first PowerPoint slide, a photo of Uncle Ted's cabin with the word condemned stamped across it in red letters. This property has been occupied by Marcus Williams, a man with no legal right to be in our valley. Despite repeated attempts to work with him, he has refused to bring his property into compliance with community standards and has become increasingly hostile toward residents. The lies flowed like water. She showed manipulated photos making Uncle Ted's cabin look dangerous and decrepit. She referenced expert assessments, concluding the property was uninhabitable. She even claimed I'd threatened violence against neighborhood children. Therefore, Brenda announced, I'm calling for an emergency vote to condemn this property and authorize legal action to force its immediate sale. Several residents stood to support her motion, clearly people who'd been promised something in exchange for their loyalty. But I noticed more people shifting uncomfortably, looking around the room like they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Before you vote, I said, standing up from the back of the room, I'd like to address these accusations. You don't have the right to speak at this meeting, Brenda snapped. You're not a member of this HOA. Actually, I said, walking toward the front of the room, I think the community deserves to hear all the facts before making such an important decision. Sheriff Rodriguez nodded for me to proceed, and I opened my briefcase. Let's start with the claim that I have no legal right to be here. I held up Uncle Ted's original homestead grant from 1962. This document shows that my family has owned this valley for over 60 years, decades before your HOA even existed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people processed what they were hearing. But here's what's really interesting, I continued, pulling out the 1995 lease agreement. My family never actually sold this land. We leased development rights to a construction company, with the requirement that all residents be informed they were purchasing homes on leased land. The murmurs grew louder. People were turning to their neighbors, asking if anyone had been told about lease agreements when they bought their houses. According to these county records, I said, holding up the financial documents, the HOA has owed my family $3,000 a month in lease payments for the past 5 years. The total debt is currently $180,000. That's when Brenda tried to regain control. Those documents are forgeries, she shouted. This man is trying to defraud our entire community. Really? I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's audio system. Then maybe you can explain this recording from last night. Brenda's own voice filled the room. Those 3 families deserved what they got. They were asking too many questions, causing problems, threatening property values. The confession continued for 3 minutes, with Brenda admitting to harassment campaigns, financial fraud, and witness intimidation. By the time it finished, you could have heard a pin drop in that packed room. And finally, I said, here's security footage from last night. The video showed Dale clearly starting the fire that nearly killed me, with audio of him coordinating with Brenda about making the problem go away permanently. That's when Sheriff Rodriguez stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to inform you that Dale Kessler was arrested last night for arson and attempted murder. He has provided a full confession detailing financial crimes, property sabotage, and witness intimidation spanning 3 years. The room erupted. Residents shouted questions, demanded answers, and called for Brenda's immediate resignation. Several people were crying as they realized how thoroughly they'd been deceived and manipulated. Brenda tried one last desperate play. "You don't understand what this man is trying to do," she screamed over the chaos. "He wants to evict all of you. He owns your land, and he can throw you out of your homes." The room went dead silent. "Actually," I said into the microphone, "I'd like to propose a different solution." I explained my offer. Honor the existing leases at reduced rates, share profits from any genuine community improvements, and establish the Theodore Williams Memorial Scholarship for local veterans pursuing education. The crowd's relief was palpable. Instead of losing their homes, they were being offered a chance to live in a community run by honest leadership at lower costs than they'd been paying under Brenda's corrupt regime. All in favor of removing Brenda Kessler from HOA leadership and accepting Mr. Williams's proposal? Sheriff Rodriguez called out. The vote was unanimous except for 3 people. And even they didn't vote against it. They just sat in stunned silence. As deputies escorted Brenda from the building, she turned back one last time. "This isn't over," she snarled. "Yes, Brenda," I said into the microphone. "It is." 6 months later, Pine Ridge Valley felt like the community Uncle Ted had always believed it could become. The new HOA board, elected democratically with complete financial transparency, managed neighborhood affairs without a single harassment complaint or inflated fee. Property values rose as word spread about the valley's transformation from a place ruled by fear to one governed by mutual respect and honest leadership. I made the decision to stay permanently, using the insurance money from the fire damage to restore Uncle Ted's cabin exactly as he'd built it, but with modern safety upgrades he would have appreciated. The sustainable farm I started using his old garden plots now supplies fresh vegetables to half the valley, sold on the honor system from a roadside stand that hasn't lost a dollar to theft. Justice was served completely and thoroughly. Brenda received 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Dale got 2 years for arson and property destruction, with an additional year for attempted murder. The couple was ordered to pay full restitution to the community, money that funded genuine improvements instead of phantom projects that enriched their bank accounts. Most importantly, the corrupt system they'd built was completely dismantled and replaced with honest, accountable leadership. The annual Theodore Williams Memorial Scholarship now honors veterans pursuing higher education, funded by a portion of the reduced lease revenues. This year's first recipient was Sarah Martinez, Doris Heather's granddaughter, who's studying environmental law at Colorado State, with plans to protect rural communities from development exploitation. The 3 families who'd been forced out by Brenda's harassment campaigns all returned to the valley they'd never wanted to leave. The new leadership not only welcomed them back with formal apologies, but helped them recover some of the financial losses they'd suffered from forced sales. Tom Breslin reopened his hardware store without paying a penny in business improvement fees. The Peterson family's children now play on a community playground built with actual community input rather than authoritarian decree. Doris Heather, at 78 years old, became the new HOA secretary and helped draft bylaws that prevent any future abuse of power. Her years of fighting corruption were finally vindicated, and she's become a mentor for younger residents learning about property rights and community organizing. The practical lessons I learned became a guide I share with others facing similar situations. Always research your property's complete history before buying. County records reveal ownership details, easements, and rights that real estate agents often miss or misunderstand. Document every incident of harassment with photos, recordings, and detailed logs that can serve as evidence later. Know your rights regarding HOA authority, especially the crucial legal difference between properties that voluntarily joined associations versus those that existed before HOA formation. Here's what everyone needs to remember. Property surveys can reveal ownership rights you never knew you had. HOAs cannot retroactively claim authority over properties that existed before their formation. That's settled law in every state. Financial transparency is required by law in community associations, which means residents have the right to examine books, budgets, and contracts. The story's impact reached far beyond our mountain valley. The local TV coverage went viral online, inspiring other communities to investigate their own HOA leadership and financial practices. I've received dozens of contacts from residents facing similar corruption, and several state legislators have proposed strengthening homeowner protection laws based on what happened here. For me personally, the experience brought healing I never expected. I finally understood why Uncle Ted had chosen mountain solitude after experiencing the worst of human nature in Vietnam. The peace of honest neighbors and natural beauty provided what no city could offer. Protecting this community from corruption honored his memory better than any monument ever could. Uncle Ted left me one final surprise during the cabin renovation. Behind a false wall I'd never noticed, I found a hidden room containing family heirlooms, his military medals, and a letter explaining that he'd always hoped I would eventually come home to the valley where our family belonged. There was also a hand-drawn map showing additional family land holdings in neighboring counties. Adventures for another day, maybe. These days, the cabin's front porch hosts evening conversations between neighbors who actually enjoy each other's company. The smell of Uncle Ted's workshop mingles with laughter as children play in the restored garden where he once taught me about growing food and growing character. The sound of our creek flows peacefully through a valley where honest people can finally live without fear of arbitrary punishment or financial exploitation. Your turn to share. Drop your HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You'd be amazed how many people have dealt with similar corruption and abuse of power disguised as community improvement. And hit that subscribe button because there are more stories of justice served coming your way. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done differently in my situation? The valley that almost destroyed a family legacy became the place where it was reborn. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something better than what came before and making sure it lasts for the next generation.